The first drift swallowed the fence line sometime after midnight. By dawn, the path between cabins was gone, replaced by a smooth white rise shaped by wind and silence. Smoke from the neighboring chimneys lifted straight up into a sky the color of iron. No one noticed at first that her chimney did not smoke. They were too busy feeding their own fires, shaking frost from blankets, and stomping boots against thresholds hardened with ice. She had built her cabin in late summer, alone except for the sound of cicadas and the steady rhythm of her axe. It stood smaller than the others, tucked lower against the slope where the hill curved like a cupped hand. The walls were plain logs, notched tight, chinked carefully with clay and straw. No extra layer, no packed wool, no thick moss stuffed between seams. She had refused help more than once. When a neighbor offered spare boards for lining the interior, she smiled and said she would. "Teen need them. Winter will teach you otherwise," old Mr. Turner had said, tapping his pipe against the heel of his boot. She only nodded. By October, while others stacked cordwood into tall ranks against their cabins, she hauled something stranger. Stones. Smooth river stones carried up from the bend below, laid in careful rows along the inside wall. She dug shallow trenches before setting the floorboards, shaping the earth beneath the cabin with a patience that made onlookers shake their heads. "She is wasting time," they said. "Snow does spare fools." When the first frost silvered the valley, she was ready. Not with a stove. Not with a brick hearth. There was no iron chimney pipe, no stack of oak and hickory beside her door. Only a single narrow flue she had built of clay near the rear wall, hardly larger than a stovepipe, and even that remained unused most days. The storm arrived early in December. It came with a wind that bent saplings flat and drove powder through cracks no one knew existed. By nightfall the valley had vanished under a white roar. Cabins groaned. Doors refused to shut cleanly. Firewood piles shrank faster than expected as men fed flames that seemed to give nothing back. In her cabin, she lit one small fire at dusk. Not in a grand hearth, but in a shallow, stone-lined pit at the center of the floor. It burned low and steady for 2 hours, just enough to warm the stones she had gathered and the earth beneath the planks. Then she let it die. Outside, snow piled against her walls. By morning, her roofline was half gone beneath drifts. By afternoon, no part of the cabin remained visible except a faint swell in the snowfield where the hill curved differently than before. It was on the second day that neighbors began to worry. "She hasn't come for water," Mrs. Hale observed, peering through the small square of clear glass in her frost-rimmed window. "And no smoke," added her husband. They waited until the wind quieted. It took another day. By then, the valley looked like a blank page. 4 men set out with shovels. They followed what they thought was the path by memory alone, counting paces from Turner's fence post to the slope where her cabin stood. At first they found nothing but powder, waist-deep and loose. Then one shovel struck something firm. Wood. They dug faster. Snow fell inward as they carved a trench downward. It packed heavy around their boots. At last, one of them uncovered the edge of her door. It was sealed tight beneath a ridge of white. "She'll have frozen," someone muttered. They cleared the door and knocked. No answer. Mr. Turner pressed his ear against the wood. He paused, frowning. "Step back," he said quietly. They did. He lifted the latch. The door opened inward without resistance, and a breath of air rolled out to meet them. It was not the brittle, knife-edged cold they expected. It was cool, yes, but soft, still, almost temperate. They stared. Inside, the cabin glowed faintly in reflected light from the snow tunnel they had dug. The air did not bite their lungs. Their breath did not plume thickly. The floor was dry, the wall unglazed with frost, and there she sat near the center, wrapped in a wool shawl, reading by the light of a small oil lamp. She looked up as if their arrival were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You took your time," she said gently. For a moment no one spoke. The snow had sealed her cabin entirely. There had been no smoke for days, no visible source of heat, and yet the space felt warmer than the men's own draft-ridden homes where fires roared day and night. "How?" Turner finally asked. She closed her book and gestured toward the floor. "Sit," she said. "Feel." Reluctantly they stepped inside. One man knelt and pressed his palm to the wooden planks. Warm. Not hot, not heated like iron, but holding a steady, quiet warmth. "The earth keeps what you give it," she explained, "if you give it slowly." Before winter, she had carved shallow channels beneath the cabin, lining them with stone. When she lit her small evening fire, the heat sank downward, absorbed by the rocks and the packed soil beneath. Stone and earth held warmth longer than air ever could. By letting the fire burn low and long instead of high and furious, she had stored heat in the ground itself. And the snow? Asked Mrs. Hale from the doorway. She smiled. Snow is only cold when it moves. When it piles thick and still, it insulates better than wool. By being buried, her cabin had gained a second wall. The drifts pressed tight against the logs, sealing cracks, blocking wind. What others cursed as suffocation, she had anticipated as shelter. Inside, the temperature held steady far above the outside air that howled beyond the white barrier. But you've no stove? One man insisted, glancing around for hidden iron. I have no need to burn all night, she replied, only to warm the bones of the place. They looked at each other, uncertain whether to be impressed or ashamed. In their cabins, flames devoured wood without mercy. Heat rushed upward, vanishing through wide chimneys. Cold crept in through gaps and seams, chased by wine that found every weakness. She had built differently. Lower to the ground, tucked into the hillside, floor set close over earth, rather than raised high on piers where air could scour beneath. Stones placed not for decoration, but for memory holding yesterday, as warmth for today as comfort. And when the storm ends, Turner asked, then I dig out, she said simply. They left her that afternoon with more questions than answers. Word spread quickly through the valley. Some called it luck, others called it witchcraft. A few called it sense. Over the next week, as wood piles dwindled and tempers shortened, more neighbors came to see. Each arrived skeptical. Each left thoughtful. She showed them the trenches beneath the floor once the snow was cleared from the doorway enough to allow more light. She explained how a slow burn allowed heat to sink rather than flee. She demonstrated how sealing the cabin tight before snowfall reduced drafts that would otherwise steal warmth. You fight winter, she told them, and it will win. You work with it, and it will build your walls for you. By mid-season, 2 men had begun digging beneath their own cabins. Another stacked stones along his interior wall. Mrs. Hale stuffed additional clay into gaps before the next storm arrived. The valley changed in quiet ways that winter. Fires burned lower, chimneys smoked less, wood piles lasted longer. And when the next blizzard came, they did not panic at the rising drifts. They watched instead as snow crept up their walls, sealing them in white silence. In her cabin, she lit her small evening fire once more. It flickered gently against the stones, warming them like old friends. She fed it only a few split logs, then let it fade. Outside, the world vanished again beneath wind and frost. Inside, the earth remembered. Days later, when the storm cleared and neighbors emerged from their buried homes, they found something unexpected. Their cabins, too, felt steadier, less cruel. The cold no longer clawed so fiercely at their ankles. The air held a gentler edge. They looked toward her hill and saw only a smooth white rise once more. This time, they did not hurry with shovels. They knew she was warm. Winter did not end quickly that year. It lingered, testing them with sudden freezes and heavy skies, but the valley endured. Fewer cords were burned. Fewer pipes cracked. Fewer hands went numb in the night. When spring finally loosened the earth and snow receded into streams, her cabin emerged like something reborn. The logs were dark but sound. The stones inside lay exactly where she had placed them months before. Neighbors gathered one mild afternoon, standing outside her door not in alarm but in respect. You plan for burial, Turner said quietly. I plan for stillness, she corrected. Cold moves. Stillness holds. They nodded. From then on, new cabins in the valley were built lower. Trenches were carved before floors were laid. Stones were gathered in summer and stacked within reach. They still burned fires. They still chopped wood, but they burned smarter, slower, with purpose rather than panic. And every winter after, when the first drift swallowed the fence line and the valley turned white and silent, no one feared the snow the way they once had, because they had seen what lay beneath it. Not tragedy, not frostbitten despair, but a cabin buried under snow, warmer than the world outside, proving that sometimes survival is not louder fire but quieter wisdom. When she told them she would not build a fireplace, the valley went quiet in the way it does before laughter. Men paused mid-swing with their axes. Women looked up from wash basins and breadboards. Even the children stopped their games to hear the rest of it, certain they had misunderstood. No hearth? Mr. Turner asked, his brows knitting together beneath the brim of his hat. Not even a small one? Not like yours, she replied calmly. He glanced over his shoulder at the broad stone mouth of his own fireplace, wide enough to swallow half a tree at a time. Flames leapt inside it day and night, once November came. It was the pride of his cabin, the symbol of preparedness, the beating heart of his home. Winter does tea forgive pride, he warned. I am not relying on pride, she said. I am relying on patience. That answer satisfied no one. In late August, when most families were stacking split oak in tight, orderly cords against their walls, she was hauling earth. Not to build up, but to carve down. She chose a place at the base of a low rise where the hill sloped gently toward the creek. Instead of raising her cabin high on stones to keep it above damp ground, she cut into the earth itself, lowering the floor line until it sat just above packed soil. "You'll rot from below," Mrs. Hale called out one afternoon. "I'll seal it," she replied. They watched her lay down flat stones across the packed dirt, fitting them like puzzle pieces. Over those stones she spread a layer of clay mixed with straw and ash, tamping it down until it hardened like brick. Only then did she set her floorboards in place. No cellar, no roaring hearth, no brick chimney reaching skyward. Instead, she built small. Her walls rose from tight-notched logs, carefully chosen and fitted so closely that daylight barely traced their seams. Where others stuffed moss between gaps as a hurried afterthought, she pressed clay deep and smoothed it flush. She added a narrow vent near the roofline, not for smoke from a grand fire, but for gentle airflow. By October, her cabin looked nearly finished except for one glaring absence. There was no fireplace cut into one wall, no massive stone structure dominating the room, no iron crane for kettles. "You still have time," Turner said one evening, leaning against her doorway. "I've extra fieldstone. We can lay you a proper hearth in 2 days." She shook her head. "I won't need it." The first frost came early that year. It silvered the valley overnight and turned the creek, as edges to glass. Smoke began rising thick from chimneys at dawn, curling against pale skies. Inside the larger cabins, fires roared, wood popping and snapping in a constant battle against creeping cold. Her cabin, by contrast, showed no smoke. Children dared one another to approach and press their ears to her walls, expecting silence and the brittle quiet of a frozen space. Instead, they heard movement. The scrape of a chair, the soft rhythm of a broom, life continuing as usual. She must be hiding a stove, someone muttered, but no iron had ever been hauled to her sight. No heavy castings had been dragged up from town. When the first true cold snap struck in mid-November, the temperature plunged hard enough to freeze water buckets solid overnight. Turner, as great hearth, devoured wood twice as fast as before. He fed it constantly, sweat dampening his shirt even as the corners of his cabin remained stubbornly cold. Wind found cracks around window frames. Drafts curled along the floor, biting ankles and sending children scrambling closer to flames. Across the slope, her door remained shut. No smoke rose. By early December, snow arrived in earnest, not a gentle dusting, but a driving wall that erased fence lines and swallowed paths. It piled high against cabins, forcing men to shovel entryways clear each morning. Her cabin began to disappear. Snow pressed against its sides, climbing halfway up the walls in less than a day. The low roofline she had chosen allowed drifts to crest over its peak, creating a smooth white curve. "She is trapped," Mrs. Hale whispered. Turner frowned but said nothing. Pride or not, no one deserved to freeze. On the third morning of heavy snow, he set out with 2 others. They carried shovels and ropes. The wind had quieted, but the cold had sharpened. Slicing through wool coats and stiffening beards with frost, they reached the spot by memory alone. Where her cabin had stood was now a rounded mound indistinguishable from the hillside. They dug. Snow fell inward, compact and heavy. After several minutes, a hollow thud answered one shovel strike. Wood. They cleared the outline of her door and knocked hard. No answer. Turner pressed his ear to the wood. For a moment he heard only his own pulse, then faintly a shift inside. A footstep. The latch lifted. The door opened inward, and a wave of air brushed against them. It was not hot, but it was not the brittle cold they expected either. It felt steady. She stood there wrapped in a thick sweater, her cheeks flushed with health rather than frostbite. "You are digging my roof away," she said mildly. Turner blinked past her into the cabin. No roaring hearth dominated the room. No blaze crackled in a stone mouth. Instead, along the far wall, a low structure of brick and clay curved, gently upward like the back of a resting animal. Its surface was smooth, unblackened by soot. Beside it sat a small iron door no larger than a loaf of bread. "What is that?" one of the men asked. "My stove," she said. They stepped inside. The warmth surprised them. It was not the uneven heat of a fireplace, no scorching front and freezing corners. The air felt balanced, almost even from floor to ceiling. Turner removed his gloves slowly. "You've no chimney?" he observed. "There is one," she replied, pointing to a narrow clay pipe that snaked upward from the far end of the structure before disappearing through the wall. "But the smoke travels a longer road first." She knelt and opened the small iron door. Inside lay a compact firebox no bigger than a bucket. A modest flame flickered there, quiet and controlled. "You can heat a cabin with that?" Turner insisted. She smiled faintly. Not with the flame, with what it leaves behind. She explained how the fire burned hot but short each evening. Instead of sending its heat straight up a chimney, the smoke was forced through winding channels built inside the thick clay and brick bench before exiting. As it traveled, it gave up its warmth to the mass surrounding it. The curved structure along the wall was not decoration. It was a thermal battery. She placed her palm flat against its surface. Turner did. Warm, deeply warm. Not surface heat like iron fresh from flame, but something steady, stored. The bench holds the heat long after the fire dies, she said. By morning, the air is still tempered. He glanced at the ceiling. No smoke stains marked it. The walls remained clear. How much wood? He asked finally. 2 armfuls a day. Turner thought of the stack outside his cabin, shrinking faster with each cold night. He burned nearly triple that, and still his back room felt like a cellar. But snow as against your walls, Mrs. Hale said from the doorway. Doesn't that smother you? She shook her head. Snow blocks wind. Wind steals heat faster than cold alone. Her low-built cabin, partially embraced by the hillside, allowed drifts to seal gaps others never noticed. The snow became insulation, not threat. You refused a fireplace, Turner murmured, half to himself. I refused waste, she corrected gently. They lingered longer than they intended. The quiet inside her cabin contrasted sharply with the constant crack and roar they were used to. There was no need to sit huddled close to flame. The warmth wrapped evenly around them. When they finally left, the wind had begun to rise again. They dug the entrance clear enough for her to come and go if needed, but she seemed unconcerned. That evening, Turner sat before his massive hearth and studied it with new eyes. Flames leapt high, licking at the chimney throat, racing upward as though eager to escape. He felt heat against his shins but cold at his shoulders. He thought of her small firebox, of smoke forced to linger, of heat persuaded to stay. The next day he burned his fire lower, not out of confidence, but curiosity. Winter tightened its grip through January. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze ink in bottles and split logs left too long outside. Yet something subtle shifted across the valley. Fires grew smaller. Men began experimenting. One carved a narrow baffle inside his chimney to slow the draw. Another stacked bricks behind his stove to absorb warmth before it fled. They spoke of her methods cautiously at first, as if admitting defeat. She burns less, Hale observed one afternoon, and seems warmer for it, Turner admitted. One bitter morning, when frost traced intricate patterns across window glass, Turner made his way back to her cabin alone. Snow lay thick again, though not as violently as before. She invited him inside without surprise. I've been thinking, he began awkwardly, about the way smoke travels. She nodded, pouring him tea. He studied the curved clay bench along her wall. It radiated quiet heat, enough to ease the stiffness in his fingers without scalding. Show me, he said. So she did. She removed a small clay panel near the base, revealing the winding path within. The channel snaked back and forth, lengthening the smoke-s journey before release. It isn't to the size of the fire, she explained. It's the time you keep its warmth. He ran a hand along the channel, marveling at its simplicity. And you built this alone? Yes. He shook his head, partly in disbelief, partly in respect. Over the next weeks, Turner began dismantling part of his grand hearth. Neighbors stared as stones were pulled away and rearranged. He reduced the firebox, narrowed the throat, added brick along the back wall to capture heat. The first night he tested it, he felt foolish. The flame seemed too small, the room too quiet. But by morning, the air remained tolerable, without adding wood through the night. He returned to her cabin to report the result, half embarrassed, half proud. You were right, he admitted simply. She shrugged lightly. Winter teaches anyone willing to listen. By February, 3 cabins in the valley had modified their hearths. Wood consumption dropped noticeably, smoke rising from chimneys thinned. The valley air cleared. The scent of burning oak no longer hung heavy from dawn to dusk. More surprising was the silence. Without constant roaring fires, cabins felt calmer. Families spoke without raising voices over crackling flames. Children no longer crowded dangerously close to hearths to escape drafts. Her decision not to build a traditional fireplace had begun as mockery. Now it sparked imitation. Late one afternoon, as another snowstorm gathered on the horizon, Turner stood beside her outside the cabin. You could have told us plainly, he said. I did, she replied with a faint smile. You did to hear. He laughed softly, conceding the point. The storm rolled in overnight, burying the valley once more. This time, fewer faces showed fear. Cabins were sealed tighter. Fires burned slower. Her roof vanished beneath drifts again, snow sculpting smooth curves across its surface. But no one hurried with shovels. They knew what lay beneath. Inside, she lit her small evening fire, feeding it carefully until the clay mass absorbed its fill. Then she closed the iron door and watched as flames dwindled to embers. The bench along her wall glowed faintly in lamplight, radiating the day, stored warmth. Outside, wind howled across the white expanse. Inside, warmth lingered without noise. When spring finally softened the earth and snow retreated into the creek, cabins emerged like ships after a long voyage. Wood piles, once shrinking with alarming speed, still held reserves. Turner stood before his altered hearth and realized he had burned nearly half the wood he once did. Across the slope, her cabin appeared unchanged, modest, low, unassuming. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the valley. They no longer equated survival with roaring flames. They understood now that heat could be guided, persuaded, stored. All because one woman refused to build a fireplace the way everyone else did. They had called it foolishness. Winter had called it wisdom. The storm did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived with a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. The sky lowered for 2 days before the first flakes fell, pressing gray against the valley until even the dogs refused to bark. Then the wind turned, and winter descended in a single, unbroken wall of white. By nightfall, fences had vanished. By dawn, roofs sagged beneath the weight. By the second day, cabins were no longer buildings but shapes, rounded humps rising from a blank landscape. They had all prepared as best they could. Wood was stacked high, water barrels were filled, doors were reinforced, fires were lit before sunset and never allowed to die. Except hers. She had never relied on a roaring hearth. Neighbors noticed that first winter when smoke rarely rose from her chimney, but they had stopped questioning it. She kept to herself, built low against the hillside, and refused help when it came to fireplaces and iron stoves. Still, as the snow deepened past the window ledges and wind-carved drifts taller than a man, unease crept through the valley. On the third morning of unbroken storm, Mrs. Hale noticed something that tightened her chest. "I can see her cabin," she whispered. Turner stepped outside despite the wind slicing at his coat. He squinted toward the slope where the small cabin stood. There was nothing, only a smooth white rise, indistinguishable from the hillside behind it. "She's buried," he muttered. They had all known snow could climb high, but this was different. This was erasure. All that day, the storm raged. No one could step more than a few paces from their doors without losing direction. Snow swallowed footprints in seconds. The wind roared so loudly it drowned thought. By night, fear settled in. "She'll suffocate," someone said. "Or freeze," another replied. Turner sat before his hearth, feeding logs into the blaze with more force than needed. Flames leapt high, but the far corners of his cabin still felt cold. He stared into the fire and imagined her cabin sealed under feet of snow, no chimney visible, no air moving. He slept poorly. When dawn came and the wind finally weakened to a bitter whisper, 4 men gathered without speaking much. They wrapped scarves high over their faces and took up shovels. The valley looked unfamiliar, flattened and reshaped. They moved carefully, counting steps from landmarks now hidden beneath white. Turner led them by memory, measuring distance from where the old oak should be to where the slope began. They reached the spot and saw only a broad mound. "Here," Turner said. They began digging. Snow fell inward in heavy slabs. The drifts were dense, compacted by wind into something almost solid. It took time more than they expected to carve a trench downward. At last, one shovel struck wood. They cleared more carefully after that, brushing snow aside until the faint outline of a door appeared. It was sealed tight, the handle barely visible. "Knock," Hale urged. Turner rapped hard against the wood. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. A terrible quiet settled among them. Wind rustled the upper drifts, but beneath their feet, the world seemed suspended. Turner pressed his ear to the door. At first, he heard only the echo of his own breathing. Then faint, steady a sound, not wind, not creaking timbers, movement. He stepped back and lifted the latch. The door resisted slightly, packed by snow pressure from outside. Then it gave way. A soft rush of air met them, not the cutting blade of frozen emptiness. Cool, yes, but alive. They hesitated, stunned. Inside, lamplight glowed dimly. The space did not shimmer with frost. No ice coated the walls. No bitter cloud of breath filled the room. And there she sat, wrapped in wool, a book resting in her lap. "You've made quite a mess of my front step," she said mildly. Hale stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "You alive." She blinked. Hadn't he noticed otherwise? They stepped inside slowly, boots crunching lightly on dry floorboards. "How?" Turner demanded. She rose and gestured toward the walls. "Close the door. You were letting the cold in." They obeyed. The moment the door shut, the outside roar dulled to a distant murmur. The air inside felt astonishingly stable, neither warm like a summer kitchen nor freezing like the cabins they'd left. It held steady, like the inside of a root cellar in early autumn. "There's no fire," Hale whispered. A small iron stove sat near one wall, but no flame burned within it. Its door was closed, cool to the touch. "I burned last night," she said. "Not today." Turner walked slowly around the room. The walls were thick logs, chinked tightly. But he noticed something else, shelves lined with jars filled with sand and stones. Along the lower half of the interior, a second layer of clay had been applied, forming a smooth coating over the logs. "You sealed it," he murmured. She nodded. Before winter, she had layered clay thickly along the inner walls, pressing it deep into cracks and smoothing it across surfaces. It hardened into a dense barrier that blocked drafts others did. Know they had. Beneath the floorboards, she had laid flat stones across packed earth, creating mass that absorbed warmth when the stove burned and released it slowly over hours. "And the snow?" Hale asked. She walked to a small window barely visible under the drift outside. "Snow is not your enemy when it is still," she said. It's trapped air. It insulates better than wood alone. By being buried, her cabin had gained a blanket. The drifts blocked wind entirely, sealing every seam. They stood in silence, absorbing the realization. Outside, wind chill plunged far below freezing. In their own cabins, fires roared constantly, yet floors remained icy near walls. Here, in a cabin entombed under snow, the temperature held steady enough to sit without gloves. "You were buried alive," Hale whispered. She smiled faintly. "Buried, yes. Alive, certainly." Turner ran a hand along the clay-coated wall. It felt solid, dense. "How long could you last like this?" She shrugged. "As long as my wood holds. Longer than most, I think." He thought of his dwindling stack. The stove she used was small but efficient. She burned it hot and short, letting the stones beneath the floor and the clay along the walls store the heat. When flames died, warmth remained in the mass. "What about air?" one of the younger men asked. She pointed to a narrow vent near the roofline. Snow had covered it, but she had left a hollow channel within the drift leading outward. Air could move slowly without letting wind scour the interior. They had expected tragedy. They found design. Word spread fast once they returned. "She is warmer than we are," Hale admitted to his wife. That night, as the storm threatened to rise again, Turner studied his own cabin. Wind slipped beneath his door despite a rolled blanket pressed against it. His large chimney pulled heat upward relentlessly. He imagined his cabin buried entirely in snow. Would it grow warmer or suffocate? The next morning, he visited her again, this time alone. "You weren't tea afraid?" he asked. She poured tea, steam curling gently upward. "Afraid of snow?" she said. "No? Of being sealed in?" She shook her head. "I built for it." She explained how she had chosen the slope deliberately. The hillside shielded the north wind. The low roof encouraged drifts to settle rather than scour. Before winter, she had tested how snow piled along the walls during smaller storms. "You anticipated burial?" Turner said slowly. "I anticipated stillness," she corrected. "Cold steals when it moves." He looked around again. In his own cabin, flames crackled loudly, competing with drafts. Heat rose and vanished. Here warmth seemed to linger as if reluctant to leave. "Show me," he said quietly. She knelt and lifted one floorboard near the center. Beneath it lay a layer of stone still faintly warm from the previous night, as fire. "Mass," she said. "You must give heat somewhere to stay." He nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson not as theory but as lived proof. The valley endured another week of bitter cold. Snow remained piled high, cabins half hidden. But fear had lessened. Neighbors no longer panicked at rising drifts. They saw in them potential insulation. Some began packing snow intentionally against lower walls to block drafts. Others sealed cracks more carefully with clay instead of relying solely on moss. Fires burned lower. By late January, when a second major storm struck, no one rushed to her slope with shovels. They trusted. Inside her cabin, she burned a small fire each evening, fitting the stove just enough to recharge the stones beneath and the clay around her. Outside, snow climbed high once more, burying the structure almost completely. Inside, she read by lamplight. When the storm passed and the valley re-emerged, men walked through drifts not in alarm but in curiosity. They studied how snow lay against their own walls, how it blocked wind. Turner found himself grateful for the drift pressed against his north side. For once, that wall felt less bitter to the touch. One evening in February, a young couple knocked on her door. "We want to build like yours," the husband said, "before next winter." She invited them inside and began explaining from the beginning site selection, ceiling mass, controlled burn. They listened closely, no longer dismissing ideas that once sounded foolish. By the time spring thawed the valley, something fundamental had changed. Cabins still smoked, but less violently. Woodpiles lasted longer. Walls were sealed tighter. Snow was viewed differently, not solely as threat but as ally when understood. On the first warm day of March, when patches of earth appeared beneath melting drifts, Turna stood beside her cabin once more. "You were buried alive," he said softly. She smiled at the memory. "And warmer than the town," he added. She glanced toward the valley, where thin streams of smoke rose lazily instead of in frantic plumes. "Not warmer," she said gently, "just steadier." He nodded. The lesson had not been about heat alone. It had been about control. About working with winter instead of waging war against it. About building for stillness rather than spectacle. That first day when they had dug through snow expecting to find tragedy, they had uncovered something else entirely. A way to live with the cold without burning themselves out. A cabin buried under snow warmer not because it defied winter, but because it understood it. In the harshest winter anyone in the valley could remember, when the river froze thick enough to carry a wagon and the trees cracked at night like distant rifle shots, her cabin stood quiet against the hillside. There was no chimney coughing smoke into the iron sky. No stack of split oak leaning against the wall. No frantic chopping at dawn to feed a starving hearth. People noticed, they always noticed what was missing before they understood what was present. Her house had gone up in late summer without spectacle. The men expected to see a foundation raised high on stone piers, but she chose instead to settle it low, cutting into the slope so that the earth cradled the back wall. The roof pitched gently rather than steep and proud. The walls were tight-fitted logs, chinked not just with moss, but with layers of clay she pressed in with deliberate care, smoothing each seam until it hardened like mortar. When Turner asked where the fireplace would go, she pointed vaguely to the center of the room. "Somewhere modest," she said. He frowned. "Modest one, keep January out." She only smiled. By October, as families stacked cordwood into neat, towering ranks, she carried stones. Smooth, heavy stones from the creek bed. She laid them in shallow trenches beneath the floorboards, forming a dense layer across the center of the cabin. Along one wall, she shaped a long low bench from clay mixed with sand and straw, molding it over a framework of brick she had salvaged from an abandoned kiln miles away. It looked strange, like a sleeping animal pressed against the wall. "What is that for?" Mrs. Hale asked one afternoon. "For holding warmth," she replied. They laughed gently. Warmth to them meant flame. It meant orange light and crackling wood and the constant hunger of fire that demanded feeding. Her firebox, when it appeared, disappointed them. It was small, hardly larger than a bread oven. The chimney that rose from it was narrow, bending once before slipping through the wall. It lacked the grandeur of Turner's massive stone hearth, which dominated his cabin like a monument to survival. "You will freeze," he told her flatly. "Perhaps," she answered, not unkindly. Winter arrived early and without mercy. The first cold snap drove temperatures down so quickly that water buckets iced over in hours. Fires roared in every cabin across the valley. Smoke thickened the air, hanging low between trees. Her chimney remained mostly quiet. On the coldest night of November, when wind scoured the hills and pushed frost through the smallest cracks, Turner fed his fireplace 3 times after midnight. The front of his cabin burned hot enough to drive him back, yet the far wall felt like stone from a cellar. The heat climbed straight upward, vanishing into darkness. He imagined her cabin then silent, dim, defenseless. But when he passed by the next morning, he noticed something unsettling. Her windows were clear. Not fogged with frantic breath, not rimed with ice. Clear. He knocked. She opened the door calmly, wrapped in wool but without the stiffness of someone fighting cold all night. "You are not frozen," he said before he could stop himself. She raised an eyebrow. "Was I meant to be?" He stepped inside, bracing for disappointment, or some hidden roaring stove. Instead, he found stillness. The air did not scorch. It did not sting. It felt even like the temperature of a root cellar in late autumn. Comfortable enough to sit without gloves, cool enough that no one would call it indulgent, he glanced at the small firebox along the wall. No flames danced within it. "You did tea burn all night?" "No." "When did you last feed it?" "Yesterday evening." He stared at her, then at the clay bench. "Feel," she said. He pressed his palm to the curved surface. Warm. Not hot like iron fresh from flame, but deep warmth, steady and persistent. "The fire runs through channels inside," she explained, kneeling to remove a small panel. Beneath it lay a narrow path where smoke traveled back and forth before exiting. It gives its heat to the mass instead of throwing it away. He imagined his own chimney straight, wide, greedy. She continued. When the fire burns hot and fast, it leaves heat behind in the clay and stone. They release it slowly for hours. He thought of the wood he had consumed the night before, of the sparks flying uselessly into darkness. But the walls, he insisted. No insulation. She walked one and tapped it lightly. Clay, she said, packed thick. It blocks air. Air steals more heat than cold alone. Before winter, she had sealed every seam twice over. Not a draft crept beneath her door. Not a whisper of wind slipped between logs. And then there was the design. By setting the back wall into the slope, she let the earth temper that side naturally. Soil held a steadier temperature than open air. It did not swing wildly between extremes. You built into the hill, Turner murmured. I built with it. As December deepened, snow came in earnest. It piled against cabins in heavy drifts, forcing men to shovel constantly to keep doors from sealing shut. Her cabin, lower than the others, disappeared first. Snow pressed against its sides, climbing halfway up the walls. By the second storm, it reached the roofline. She'll suffocate, Mrs. Hale fretted. But she did not. Inside, the snow formed an insulating blanket. It blocked wind completely. The temperature inside her cabin became even more stable, shielded from the worst of the gale. Turner's own cabin, tall and proud against the slope, caught the wind head-on. Drafts found corners he noticed before. His fire burned louder, consuming more wood to compensate. One night in January, the cold plunged so deep that the air itself seemed brittle. The river groaned beneath its frozen shell. Trees split with sharp reports. In his cabin, Turner's fire blazed like a furnace, yet frost formed along the far wall. He could not ignore it anymore. The next morning he trudged through knee-deep snow to her door. She welcomed him without surprise. You are burning too much, she said before he spoke. He exhaled sharply. I am. She poured him tea and gestured toward the bench. Sit. He did. The warmth that rose through his coat was subtle but unmistakable. You think more fire means more heat, she continued, but large flames send warmth away faster than you can keep it. He nodded reluctantly. What should I change? She smiled faintly. First, seal your cracks. Then shrink your fire. He frowned. Shrink it? Burn hot and short. Let something hold the heat. He returned home unsettled but determined. Over the next week he packed clay into every seam he could find. He narrowed his chimney opening slightly, forcing smoke to linger longer before escape. He stacked bricks behind his hearth to absorb warmth. The first night he burned a smaller, hotter fire felt wrong. The room seemed too quiet. He resisted the urge to feed it again before bed. By morning he noticed something remarkable. The cabin had cooled, but not as drastically as before. The far wall was less icy. The air felt steadier. He repeated the experiment the next night. Gradually, his woodpile stopped shrinking so alarmingly. Across the valley, others began to notice similar changes after visiting her cabin. They sealed cracks more carefully. Some even built small clay benches along interior walls to capture heat. By February, the difference between her cabin and the rest had narrowed but not disappeared. One afternoon, as wind whipped loose snow across the valley, Hale stood inside her home and realized she no longer felt cold air sliding along the floor. The drift piled against her north wall blocked it. She was right, he muttered. They had thought her reckless for refusing a grand fireplace. Instead, she had rejected waste. Late in the season, when wood supplies ran low for several families, she still had a healthy stack beneath her eaves. You barely burn, Mrs. Hale observed during a visit. I burn enough, she corrected gently. The harshest winter on record did not break the valley that year. It tested them. It exposed flaws, but it also taught. When spring finally pushed meltwater down the hillsides and snow retreated into shrinking patches, cabins emerged, scarred, but standing. Turner walked the valley slowly one morning, noting changes. Clay sealed seams more tightly. Chimneys smoked less violently. Wood piles had lasted longer than expected. He stopped at her cabin. It looked modest as ever, no grand stone hearth, no towering chimney. Just a low, sturdy structure nestled against the slope. You changed the valley, he said quietly. She shook her head. Winter did. He studied the clay bench through her open door, remembering the first time he had touched its warmth. No insulation, he said thoughtfully. Not the way you meant it, she replied. No great fire. She smiled. Just design. He understood now. Heat was not only about flame. It was about where that flame's gift was stored, about blocking movement, about mass and patience. As new cabins rose in the valley that summer, they rose differently. Lower. Tighter. with benches of clay or stone built into their walls, with chimneys that bent and slowed smoke instead of freeing it too quickly. Her influence spread quietly, like warmth through clay, and when the next winter came not as brutal, but cold enough to test resolve, the valley felt prepared in a new way. Fires burned smaller. Snow was welcomed against walls. Wood lasted deeper into February, and in the cabin that once seemed foolish, for lacking insulation and roaring heat, warmth lingered steady as ever, not because it fought winter harder than the rest, but because it understood how to live within it. They mocked her cabin from the day the first log was laid, not cruelly at first, more with the casual certainty of people who believed they understood winter better than anyone who might challenge it. The valley had rules, most of them written in smoke and split oak. Cabins were raised high off the ground, roofs pitched sharp and proud to shed snow. Fireplaces were wide and deep, built of stone thick enough to outlast a lifetime. Woodpiles stood taller than a man before the first frost ever touched the grass. Her cabin broke nearly all of those rules. She built it low. Instead of raising the floor high above the earth on stacked stone piers, she carved a shallow cradle into the slope itself and settled the structure there. The back wall leaned into the hillside as though resting against it. The roofline curved gently rather than sharply. It looked less like a frontier house and more like something grown from the ground. Groundhog House. Hale had joked the first afternoon he saw it. The name stuck. When the others stacked cordwood in towering rows through September, she stacked hers modestly, barely half what Turner considered necessary. Instead of spending long days swinging an axe, she hauled clay. She mixed it with straw and ash, kneading it with her boots until it reached the texture she wanted. Then she pressed it thickly into every seam between logs, smoothing the interior walls until they formed a continuous surface. "You can't stop cold with mud," Mrs. Hale said one morning, shaking her head. "I am not stopping cold," she replied calmly. "I am stopping air." That answer drew laughter. Cold was the enemy. Air was simply part of it. Or so they believed. By October, when her cabin should have been roaring with a test fire, it sat quiet. Smoke rarely rose from the small, narrow chimney that slipped from its rear corner. Instead of a grand hearth, she had built a compact firebox connected to a winding clay channel that curved along one wall before exiting outside. It looked insufficient. Turner stood in her doorway one crisp evening, eyeing the low clay bench built against the interior wall. "You will learn soon enough," he said, not unkindly. "January will teach you." "Perhaps," she answered. Winter did not ease in gently that year. It arrived like a door slamming shut. The first real storm hit in early December. Wind tore across the valley with a violence that bent trees and drove snow sideways. Drifts rose in hours, piling against walls and climbing halfway up windows. Cabins groaned. Inside Turner, as home, his massive stone fireplace blazed day and night. He fed it constantly, armful after armful of oak, disappearing into flame. The front of his cabin grew almost unbearably hot, yet the back corners remained stubbornly cold. Wind found cracks around window frames and beneath doors, sending icy fingers along the floor. Across the slope, her cabin began to vanish. Snow drifted heavily against its low roof and curved walls. Within 2 days, only the faint outline of its peak remained visible above the white swell. "She is buried," Mrs. Hale whispered, peering through frost-laced glass. Turner watched smoke from his own chimney curl into the iron sky and frowned. No smoke rose from hers. "She's run out of wood already," someone muttered, but no one ventured out. The wind was too strong, the cold too sharp. By the third night, drifts had swallowed nearly the entire structure. Where her cabin had stood was now a smooth, rounded mound blending seamlessly into the hillside. "She'll freeze in there," Hale insisted. Turner did not answer, but unease pressed against his thoughts. Inside his cabin, flames roared louder than ever, yet he felt no comfort in them. He imagined her sitting in darkness, cold creeping inward with no great hearth to push it back. When dawn finally broke clear after days of storm, 4 men gathered without speaking much. They wrapped scarves over their faces and took up shovels. The valley looked altered, flattened, simplified, erased. They trudged through waist-deep snow toward the slope. Counting steps from memory, they found the mound easily enough. Digging proved harder. Snow packed dense by wind resisted their shovels. Each scoop fell back in heavy clumps. It took nearly an hour to reach wood, here, Turner said, brushing snow from what appeared to be the top of a doorframe. They cleared carefully after that, revealing the full outline of her door. Turner knocked hard. Silence. He knocked again, louder. Nothing. A terrible stillness settled among them. "She's gone," Hale whispered. Turner pressed his ear to the door. For a moment, He heard only wind sighing across the upper drifts. Then, a faint sound, movement. He straightened abruptly. She-s inside. He lifted the latch. The door resisted, pressed inward by snow. Then it gave way. A soft rush of air brushed against them. Not the biting edge of frozen emptiness. Cool but steady. They stared. Inside, lamplight flickered gently. The air did not shimmer with frost. The walls were dry. No ice traced their seams. And there she sat on the clay bench, wrapped in a shawl, a small iron kettle resting on the compact stove beside her. "You've dug through my roof," she observed mildly. Hale stepped inside as though entering another world. "It's warmer." He breathed. Not warm like a summer afternoon, but warmer than Turner's roaring cabin. Warmer than any place that should have been buried under 6 feet of snow. Turner removed his gloves slowly. "There's no great fire," he said, almost accusingly. She shook her head. "When did you last burn?" he asked. "Last evening," she replied. "For an hour." He stared at the clay bench lining her wall. "Feel," she said. He pressed his palm against it. Warm. Deep warmth, not surface heat, but something stored. She explained again what few had listened to in autumn. How the firebox burned hot and fast, forcing smoke through winding channels inside the clay before it escaped. How the thick walls she had built held heat long after flames died. How snow piled against her cabin acted not as a threat, but as insulation, blocking wind entirely. "You let it bury you," Hale said slowly. "I built for it," she corrected. They stood in silence, absorbing what they felt rather than what they had assumed. Outside, wind scoured the valley. Inside, air held steady. Turner glanced toward the narrow chimney pipe. "No smoke," he murmured. "Only when I burn," she replied. He thought of the wood he had fed into his fireplace through the night, of the sparks lost up his wide chimney. "You mocked my groundhog house?" she said lightly. He almost laughed. "We did." She poured them tea. Steam rose gently visible but not violent. They remained longer than intended, reluctant to step back into the cutting air outside. When they finally left, they dug the entrance clear enough for light and passage, but left much of the snow pressed tight against the walls. That evening, Turner sat before his massive hearth and felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. The flames leapt high, devouring wood, roaring against stone. Yet his far wall remained cold. Drafts curled beneath his door. He imagined shrinking the fire. It seemed foolish. And yet, over the next days, as wood piles shrank faster than expected, others visited her cabin. Each emerged with the same stunned expression. "It's steadier in there," Mrs. Hale told her husband. "Not hot, just steady." Gradually the laughter faded from their voices when they spoke of her. By mid-January, wood supplies ran dangerously low for 2 families. Snow remained deep. Travel to town was impossible. She still had half her stack untouched. Turner made the walk again one bitter morning. "Show me everything," he said simply. She did. She lifted a small floorboard to reveal flat stones laid across packed earth beneath, still faintly warm from the previous evening's fire. "Mass," she explained. "You must give heat somewhere to stay." She tapped the clay walls. "Seal air. Air steals more than cold alone." She pointed toward the snow pressed tight outside her window. "Let winter build your second wall." He nodded slowly. Back home, he began altering his own cabin. He sealed cracks with clay instead of cloth. He stacked bricks behind his hearth to absorb heat. He narrowed the chimney throat slightly, forcing smoke to linger longer. The first night he burned a smaller fire felt wrong, too quiet. But by morning the air had cooled less than expected. He tried again the next night. Wood consumption slowed. Across the valley, others followed. By February, the difference between cabins was visible. Chimneys smoked less heavily. Fires burned shorter but hotter. And when another storm rolled in, burying cabins once more, panic did not follow. They had seen what burial could bring. Insulation. Stillness. The groundhog house vanished again beneath drifting snow. But no one hurried with shovels. They knew she was warm. Inside her cabin, she lit her evening fire and watched as flames ran swiftly through the clay channels before fading. She closed the iron door and felt the bench warm beneath her. Outside, wind howled across the white expanse. Inside, warmth lingered in quiet defiance not of winter, but of waste. When spring finally thawed the valley and snow retreated into streams, cabins emerged withered but standing. Wood piles, once expected to be gone by February, still held reserves. Turner stood before her cabin one mild afternoon. "We mocked it," he said. She smiled. "And it outlasted us," he added. "It wasn't about outlasting," she replied. "It was about understanding." He looked across the valley at altered chimneys and newly sealed walls. "You changed how we build," he said. "Winter did," she answered gently. "But they knew better. They had laughed at the groundhog house, until the blizzard hit, until they dug through snow expecting to find tragedy, and found instead a cabin buried deep beneath winter. Weight warmer not because it fought harder, but because it had been designed to work with the cold rather than against it. From that winter on, the valley built differently. Lower, tighter, smarter, and whenever snow piled high against walls, no one cursed it quite the same way again. Zero insulation, they said. No chimney smoke. No firewood stacked hot against the wall. No signs of the frantic preparation that defined every other cabin in the valley once autumn sharpened the air. They watched her from a distance that first September, shaking their heads as she worked. While Turner split oak from dawn to dusk, building a corded wall taller than himself, she stacked only a modest pile beneath a lean-to at the side of her low cabin. While Hale reinforced his roof pitch to shed snow faster, she kept hers gently sloped, almost soft in its curve. While others stuffed moss between logs and nailed extra boards along interior walls, she coated hers with thick layers of clay and sand, smoothing them by hand until the seams disappeared. Winter will chew straight through that, someone muttered at the general store. She'll come begging for wood by January, another replied. Her cabin stood slightly apart from the others, tucked against a shallow hillside where the land curved inward like a protective shoulder. Instead of building tall and proud against the wind, she had chosen to settle low so low that the back wall rested partly below ground level. Groundhog House, they called it. The name followed her into winter. When October, as first frost silvered the valley, smoke began rising from every chimney except hers. The air smelled of oak and hickory as families tested their hearths before the real cold arrived. Her chimney remained quiet. Children dared one another to creep close and press hands against her walls. They expected to feel cold wood or hear the hollow echo of an empty interior. Instead, they felt nothing remarkable. The walls were neither hot nor freezing, just steady. By November, temperatures dipped hard enough to freeze buckets overnight. Turner, as great stone fireplace roared from dusk till dawn. Sparks leapt high up his wide chimney, disappearing into the sky. Heat blasted the front of his cabin, yet drafts crept along the floor behind him. He fed the fire again and again. Across the slope, her windows remained clear. No thick plume of smoke betrayed constant burning. She must be freezing, Mrs. Hale said more than once. But she was seen occasionally in the afternoons, stepping outside calmly, gathering a small armful of wood and returning without haste. Then December came in a fury. The storm that would later be spoken of for years rolled in without warning. The sky darkened by noon. Wind rose sharp and cutting, driving snow sideways until the valley vanished in white. Cabins disappeared one by one. Drifts climbed halfway up walls within hours. Rooflines blurred and softened. Paths vanished entirely. Inside Turner's home, flames roared so high he feared for the chimney stones. He fed the hearth relentlessly, sweat dampening his collar even as frost traced patterns along the back wall. He imagined her cabin in that storm low, small, defenseless. By morning, only a smooth white mound marked where her house had stood. She is buried, Hale whispered, staring out his narrow window. There was no chimney visible. No smoke rising, no movement. The storm did not ease for 2 full days. Snow packed thick and heavy, driven by wind into solid drifts. Doors were nearly sealed shut. Windows were reduced to narrow slits of gray light. On the third morning, when the wind finally weakened to a bitter whisper, Turner could no longer ignore the unease coiling in his chest. He gathered Hale and 2 others. They took shovels and rope and stepped into a world transformed, beyond recognition. The valley lay flattened, simplified into smooth curves and ridges. Landmarks had vanished. Trees bowed under weight. Fences were swallowed whole. They trudged toward the slope where her cabin had been, counting steps from memory alone. They found the mound easily. It rose gentle and featureless, indistinguishable from the hill behind it. Here, Turner said. They began digging. Snow fell inward with every scoop. It was dense, packed by wind into something nearly solid. Their arms burned from effort. Breath clouded thick before their faces. At last, a shovel struck wood. They cleared more carefully then, brushing snow aside to reveal the faint outline of a door beneath layers of white. Turner knocked hard. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. Hale's face paled. She is gone. Turner pressed his ear to the door. At first he heard nothing but his own heartbeat. Then, a faint scrape. Movement. He straightened abruptly. She is alive. He lifted the latch. The door resisted slightly under the pressure of snow, then opened inward. A rush of air rolled out to meet them. It was not the brittle blade of freezing emptiness they expected. It was cool but soft, stable, almost temperate. They stared at one another in disbelief, and inside lamplight flickered gently. No frost clung to the walls. No ice coated the floor. The air did not sting their lungs. And there she stood, wrapped in a shawl, one hand resting lightly against the clay bench that curved along her interior wall. "You've made quite a trench," she said mildly. Hale stepped inside first, boots crunching softly on dry planks. "It's warmer in here," he breathed. Warmer than Turner's cabin despite his roaring hearth. Warmer than any space that had been buried under 6 feet of snow for days. "There's no fire," Turner said, scanning the room. A small iron firebox sat near the wall, but no flame danced within it. "When did you last burn?" he asked. "Yesterday evening," she replied calmly. He stared at her as if she had spoken madness. She gestured toward the clay bench. "Feel." He removed a glove and pressed his palm against it. Warm. Not the sharp heat of fresh iron, but deep, stored warmth. "How?" Hale whispered. She knelt and opened a small panel near the base of the bench. Inside, a narrow channel curved back and forth. "The fire runs through here," she explained, "before it leaves." Instead of sending heat straight up a wide chimney, her design forced smoke to travel through winding clay passages, transferring warmth into the mass of the bench and surrounding walls before escaping outside. "You heat the air," she continued. "You heat what holds the air." They glanced around the room again. The walls were coated thickly with clay. Seams were sealed so tightly no draft whispered through. The back wall, partially embedded in the hillside, felt cool but not cold-tempered by the earth itself. "And the snow?" Turner asked. She smiled faintly. "Snow blocks wind. Wind steals more heat than cold alone." By burying her cabin low and building tight, she had allowed winter to create a second layer of insulation around her home. The drifts pressed firm against the logs, sealing gaps and stopping airflow entirely. They stood there, stunned into silence. Outside, wind scoured the valley. Inside, warmth lingered without noise or spectacle. "You have no insulation," Hale murmured. "Not in the way you mean," she replied. "And no roaring fire. Just enough." They remained longer than intended, reluctant to step back into the biting air beyond her threshold. When they finally left, Turner glanced back at the white mound her cabin had become. They had expected tragedy. Instead, they had found design. That evening, as he fed his own fireplace yet again, he watched flames leap high and vanish up his wide chimney. He imagined narrowing it. The thought felt almost rebellious. But the memory of her steady cabin lingered. Over the next days, others visited her as well. Each returned with the same quiet astonishment. "She burns less than any of us," Mrs. Hale said. "And feels warmer for it," her husband admitted. Turner began sealing cracks he had ignored for years. He packed clay thickly into seams. He stacked bricks behind his hearth to absorb heat. He adjusted the chimney throat slightly to slow the draw. The first night he burned a smaller, hotter fire felt wrong. The room seemed too quiet. By morning, however, the air had cooled less than before. He tried again the next night. Gradually, his woodpile stopped shrinking so alarmingly. Across the valley, others experimented. Chimneys were modified, walls sealed tighter. Some even built small clay benches to capture heat. By late January, when another storm rolled in, fear did not follow. Cabins were built or altered to hold warmth better. Snow pressed against walls was no longer cursed outright. Her cabin vanished again beneath heavy drifts. But no one rushed with shovels. They knew what lay beneath the white. Inside her ground-hugging home, she lit her evening fire and let it burn hot for an hour. She watched flames run through the clay channels before fading. Then she closed the iron door and sat back as warmth radiated steadily into the room. Outside, the valley howled under winter's wit. Inside, there was no roar, no frantic feeding of logs, only stillness and stored heat. When the storm cleared and neighbors emerged to clear their own doorways, they glanced toward her slope. The mound remained smooth and silent, and for the first time, no one mistook that silence for danger. By spring, woodpiles across the valley were larger than they had expected. Fewer trees had been felled. Fewer nights had been spent awake feeding flames. The cabin that winter could not freeze had changed more than its own fate. It had shifted how the valley thought about warmth. Heat was no longer a battle waged with towering flames. It was something to guide, to store, to protect from wind rather than simply throw against it. On the first mild day of March, when meltwater began to trickle down the hillside, Turner stood beside her as snow receded from her roof. "You built something winter could freeze," he said quietly. She looked out over the valley, where thin trails of smoke rose gently instead of in desperate plumes. "I built something winter could steal from," she replied. And in that difference lay everything.